Once again, welcome to Insights with Dr. Val-Addo. My name is Dr. J. Val-Addo, and over the past weeks in our presentations, we've been covering the topic, the scriptural philosophical factor that undermined Africa. And we've been able to cover the scriptural aspect of the factor, and from today we'll be covering the philosophical factor that undermined Africa's future and development. And as usual, today we're going to have something very good for you, and the topic for this presentation is how Europe targeted Africa and Africans using faulty philosophy. Again, how Europe targeted Africa and Africans using faulty philosophy. Europeans did not only misuse scripture to undermine Africa and Africans, they also use their particular original philosophy to solidify it. Their original philosophy is their original way of thinking or their wisdom that are used to in describing the people of Africa, especially living south of the Sahara. The problem that came with this kind of thinking of the Europeans is that some thinkers believe that philosophy is a special gift bestowed by some higher divine power on chosen peoples, mostly those of Western Europe. So some philosophers, and most philosophers of the Western orientation, believe that the Western Europeans are chosen people, that they have been gifted with some higher divine wisdom. And so this kind of assumption has somehow gone into the head of some Western Europeans. And so they believe themselves to be people of philosophy and higher thinking, and this actually had led the whole world into a kind of philosophical problem. Now, the additional problem that this thinking created was that the European regional or particular wisdom has now become a universal philosophy, a universal or accepted way of thinking universally. And many of you who might have studied logic and reasoning, you know that there is what we call the particulars and the universals. And with the European claim that they have been endued with special kind of wisdom, or some thinkers came out with that assumption that the Western Europeans have been gifted with a kind of wisdom, they have not considered it to be a particular way of thinking that they have. They have not considered it to be their original approach to thinking, but they have now considered it to be a universal philosophy that everybody must conform to and think that way. And in this presentation, we're going to look at some of the well-known Western European philosophers that they are proud of, and we will mention just about 3 of them and consider other utterances and other writings. We will capture some of these things from their own writings, and we will try to evaluate, as you listen to it, whether this is a a real philosophy, their wisdom, is their wisdom in what they have written. And so we will consider about 3 of them and some other writings. And these are David Hume, G.W.F. Hegel, and Herbert Spencer. David Hume, G.W.F. Hegel, and Herbert Spencer. Now, what we are going to do is to peep into their minds through their writings to find out how they viewed themselves and regarded Africans and African descent in course of historical timelines. What I mean by this is, in course of history, during the time that they lived, some of the things that they wrote down as philosophers of the Western Europeans. And many Africans, many African descents, do not even know some of these things. Now let's take up David Hume. David Hume lived in the 18th century. He was a Scottish philosopher, historian, economist, and essayist. When we say somebody is a Scottish, it means that he came from Scotland. And Scotland is part of the British Empire. It's in the European country, Western European country. And he was one of the most important figures in the history of Western philosophy and Scottish Enlightenment. Now, this man was very prominent, very important figure in Western philosophy. That means if you study Western wisdom or Western way of thinking, you will come to hear of David Hume. David Hume was also part of the Scottish Enlightenment. That means how they saw the light. And so we're going to hear some things from these wonderful people that the Western countries, Western European countries really admire. He wrote what we call essays and treatises. And I want to quote part of what he wrote in these essays and treatises. And quote, David Hume said, and I quote, "I am apt to suspect the Negroes to be naturally inferior to the white. There never was a civilized nation of any other complexion than white, nor even any individual eminent, either in action or speculation. No ingenious manufacturers among them, no arts, no sciences." Now, David Hume was talking by comparing whites with blacks. And we will come to this because when Western Europeans are talking, their only way of thinking is to compare whites with blacks. And that has been their format of reasoning. And what he said is, he is apt to suspect Negroes to be naturally inferior to white. Now, he continued that there was never a civilized nation of any other complexion than white. You see, so you see how they begin to exalt themselves. This is a philosopher. And this is the way he's reasoning. This is the way he is coming out with a kind of wisdom. And that the Negro, referring to people coming from Africa, which they normally call blacks, there are no ingenious manufacturers among them, no arts, and no sciences. Now, I would like to dispute what David Hume, one of the prominent men, philosophers in Scottish Enlightenment who opened their eyes to see the daylight. This is what he said. And this is one of the prominent figures in Western civilization or Western philosophy. I want to dispute that. Now, anyone who has really read history will know that ancient Africa has civilizations. And we also heard in one of these presentations about Africa, the word from which Africa derived. Africa was the inner part of the continent, or of Africa, was a place of the ancestors of the ruling class. These were purifiers, and they were producers or manufacturers of metals. So Africa has a civilization. Africa had sciences, and you can think of the Egyptian construction of the pyramids and all that in history. And so these philosophers are trying to just come out with whatever they want to say without consulting history, without consulting African history. And so it doesn't give any credit to anybody to call himself a philosopher when you cannot even refer to history and admit that there were sciences, there were arts, there were manufacturing, there were other things that were going there. And therefore, David Hume cannot claim that he is apt to suspect that naturally the Negroes are inferior to the white, and that there is no nation that has been civilized or is civilized than other one that is not a white. That is a lie. That is not true. Now let's go quickly to one of their renowned philosophers called George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. He lived between the 18th and the 19th century, and he was also a philosopher of a German origin. He was a German philosopher. Now, he wrote a book called Philosophy of History. In it, he made these statements, and I want to quote what Hegel wrote. It is manifest that want of self-control distinguishes the character of the Negroes. This condition is capable of no development or culture, and as we have seen them at this day, such have they always been. At this point, we leave Africa, not to mention it again, for it is no historical part of the world. It has no movement or development to exhibit. Now, I want us to listen carefully to what Hegel is saying, that it is manifest that want of self-control distinguish the character of Negroes. That means people who are Africans and of African descent manifest no self-control. That means their emotions rule over them. And this is what he says. And he said, this condition of the Negroes, that is, want of self-control, being emotional, is the condition that is capable of no development. That means the Negroes, Africans, African descent, cannot involve themselves in any development or culture or way of life because they are not able to control themselves. And that at this point, they don't want to discuss anything about Africa because they do not belong to the historical world. They don't have any part in the historical world. They don't have any movement, and they don't have any development to exhibit. Now, once again, I want to dispute what Hegel, one of the European finest philosophers, said. Now, these are falsehoods from another Western European philosopher. Now, the following are brief African responses to what Hegel said. Africa has a history, or Africa has history. Africa has culture and development achievements to show it is there in history. But Europeans were not ready to know and accept them. And so they have made up their minds, and there is nothing that we can say to make them understand. History is there. You know why they don't want to accept whatever happened in history? Because they didn't write the history. But there is evidence about African development, African civilizations, not one, but civilization that was marvelous. So we come to the question, does the African lack self-control? In the future, I will tell you why Africans will not accept certain things that Europeans did to them. There is a history behind it, that they will never accept what they did to them. And I will discuss that with history with you in the future. But I want to state that some Europeans will mistreat and provoke Africans and turn around to accuse them of want of self-control. This is an established fact that some of them will mistreat and provoke Africans and in turn or turn around to accuse them of want of self-control or being emotional. This is the way they do their things. Now, I want to cite some examples to prove this. I have many of them, but I will cite just about 3 of them for you to know that the assumptions philosophically describing and demeaning the character of the African has no basis. It hasn't got any basis. Now, one of them, and everyone might have heard of them, if you were in Africa and you did history or geography, you might have heard of Stanley. His full name is Henry Morton Stanley. He lived between the 19th and the 20th century. He was from Wales, and he was an explorer who went to Central Africa in search of David Livingstone. And many of you might have heard that. Now, from his own writings on record, we will come to know that Stanley considered people, they call them African Arabs, not African Muslims, but Arabs live in the Middle East. Of course, many of them may be Muslims, but when we say an Arab, it doesn't mean he's a Muslim. And so this is when he went to Central Africa, this is what he wrote. He called them half-caste, and he said, quote, "For the half-caste, I have great contempt or disrespect. They are neither black nor white, neither good nor bad, neither to be admired or hated. They are all things at all times." Now, listen very carefully what he wrote. And he is comparing black with white, good with bad, and what to be admired and what to be hated. And he used these kind of words to describe African Arabs. And this is so demeaning from some of these Europeans. Now, this is how he dealt with the Africans who were even not African Arabs, but Africans that he dealt with in Central Africa. And I quote, he wrote this. He said, "The savage," referring to Africans, and he called them savage. And he said, "The savage only respects force, power, boldness, and decision." So this man went to explore Africa and how to deal with people And this is how he described them. And I want to talk about other people, two more. And when I was preparing for this presentation, I happened to read the history of the Basel mission in the Gold Coast. And the Basel mission led to the planting or establishing of the Presbyterian Church. Now, their first missionary that they sent was called Andrea Rees. Now, he was from Denmark, another European country. Now, after some time, the Basel mission, their home committee that supervises their missions and missionaries, later revoked his appointment or dismissed him seminary, and these are some of his charges. One, Rees had brought some Western Indians because the Gold Coasters, the Africans in Gold Coast, were not ready to accept his message as, as an European, a white guy. And so he went to the West Indies, went to the Caribbeans, and the slaves that were freed, that were emancipated, that were freed, living in the Caribbeans. He went there and took about 24 of them to bring them to the Gold Coast. And this is how, after some time, that the natives have accepted them because they have seen somebody who is just like them and have accepted his message and were converting to Christianity. This is how this man from Denmark, this Danish man, treated them or treated one of them. And they petitioned their home mission committee. This is it. They complained about the ill treatment they received from Rees, from this European. How did he treat them? At the behest of Rees, a fellow missionary who was from Antigua, or who was from the Caribbeans, was asked to be flogged. He told his Gold Coast farm laborer or farm foreman to give him some lashes, to flog him, to beat him with a cane. And when the cane broke down, it is on record, not written by Gold Coast as only, in the Basel mission history around the world. You can check that. Rees continued punching this guy with his fists, and he kicked him with his boots. Now, this is supposed to be a missionary leader, a Christian. And this is how he acted. And these people go to say that Africans are not able to control themselves. Look at what Stanley did. Look at how he described the Africans. Look at how Rees handled them. And it is also on record, and this was one of his charges, why he was dropped or he was called back from the mission field. And I quote, occasionally, Rees became violent against the local people. He also verbally abused them when they were having meals. Now, the problem of the Caribbean or African descent or the Antiguan that Rees dealt with and kicked them and gave them blows, it wasn't over. Now, the history of the church will also tell you that this guy, he was a young man in his 20s. He learned to observe the traditional practices of the Gold Coast natives, such as the way they do their funerals, their cultural festivals, and how they dance. Of course, why wouldn't he? Because they had been taken from their roots and taken into slavery for many years. and they had been brought as missionaries. So he was observing. But you know what? Another European missionary of the Basel mission, there at that time, criticized him that he doesn't have to do that. So he would try to restrict him, and this Caribbean Christian young man serving as a missionary became angry. He left and later came back and requested to go back to his home country, Antigua. Now, they were happy and they almost sent him back, or they sent him back, but it ended in sadness. This young man died at sea on his way home. What a sad story. Now, the lesson here is that most Europeans and Africans and African descents are not able to work together for many reasons. And chief among them is because of philosophical and cultural differences. It is based on master-servant relationship that builds them into superior people and regard the other part in the relation as a subordinate, to be restricted, to be restrained, not to do certain things. This happens even in Christianity, in ministry, even in missions. But I want to shout out to those who have been able to work together, people of different upbringings and places who are Christians and ministers who are able to work together. But I want to tell you that it's always difficult because of the way Europeans behave as superiors, as masters, looking upon the other people as the people who are subordinates, as people who are to receive instruction, even in Christianity, even in ministry, even in missionary work. Now, these are just few of the examples to dispute Hegel's claim that Negroes lack self-control, when in fact the problem could be traced to their doorsteps, that they are not able to deal with other people outside themselves. And there is a pattern of emotional and character problems with Europeans that they will never accept, but there is a legal maxim or accepted theory which states, and I quote, "He who comes into equity must come with clean hands." That is, the principle of fairness will not exonerate an accuser from blame or to profit from a wrongdoing if found to have been involved in the same wrongdoing. Now, and so most of the time you hear Europeans criticizing Africans that they are not people of character, that they are emotional. But if I were to give you examples, today I've given you just three. One is Stanley, number two is Rees, who was a missionary, number three is another European history, a missionary. I can give you several examples, and you will question the character of Europeans in their dealing with Africans and African descent. And you will find it so appalling that that is not the way they should relate. And I have a serious question. The serious question is, why will some Europeans like Stanley, Chris, or Rees, and the other missionary bold to mistreat Africans and African descent and not admit it as sin or admit it as a sign of violence, but they take pride in it either by remaining silent or writing it down or defending it? In actual fact, they are betraying themselves as people who do not really accept their fault, accept their sin, and confess it and repent of it, and yet blame the other person. Now, quickly, Hegel, who said this, you know that Hegel has the greatest accusation. He laid the foundation for the doctrine of racism. in Germany in a discourse in 1830, a year before he died. It's called The Doctrine of Racism, and it promotes white superiority over so-called black people. That is what Hegel, one of the respected professors or philosophers, propounded, and it has gained roots up to this time. Hegel and all his justifiers of the doctrine of racism said something, that Africa had no history of their own prior to direct contact with Europe, and therefore had no development of their own. This is false. This is false. And they propounded all this falsehood in order to marshal support in the Western world against Africa. This is how they targeted Africa, to undermine it with their kind of reasoning, their kind of philosophy, without any basis on African history and without basis on African civilization and the way Africa has developed over the time. The conclusion drawn by the advocates of the justifiers of Hegel's doctrine of racism said that Africans, and I want to quote, were not properly human and could not be left to themselves, but be led to civilization by other peoples, that is, by the people of Europe, especially Western Europe, and most particularly of Britain and France. This is those who supported him. That's what they said. They said that Africans were not properly human. We are not properly. All these things have been written. It's part of history, part of philosophy. But many people do not know. And then you go to college and you study Hegel, you study all this thing, and you respect them as renowned philosophers. And they said that they could not be left to themselves. This is the secret. They think that they should not leave us to ourselves, because somebody had to lead the Negro, the African descent into civilization. If they will be civilized, they will have to lead them. And especially people from Europe and from Western Europe, especially Britain, France. And so, you see, racism, that is the white superiority over black people, came as a result of this German philosopher, Hegel. Now, we will continue this presentation another time, and we will take up another philosopher and a German publication that painted a gloom picture about Africa and Africans in the 19th century, which led to the scramble and the partitioning of Africa, and some penitent questions about Western European philosophy. We want to thank you so much for listening to us, and we believe that you have taken this presentation in good faith, and we pray that you will begin to understand what is going on in philosophy and in history, and that we should not think that some people are philosophers wiser than any other person without consulting to African history, by distorting it just to lead Africans their way in every area of life, including Christianity. And they use that to build the superiority-inferiority complex and to lead us to do what they want to do. And we will talk about this more in another time. Well, we want you to give us a thumb up if this presentation has opened your eyes to truth. Please subscribe to our presentations, because we believe that is going to open your eyes So try and press the subscribe button of the Insights with Dr. Val-Addo, and you will be blessed so much. When you do that, you will receive every presentation that comes out of the vine, out of the pipeline. You will receive it. And we want you to click the share button and send it to friends and relatives, especially Africans and Europeans, that they will benefit from it, because this is a time of eye-opening. Somebody was involved in Scottish Enlightenment. We are involved in African Enlightenment, that our history matters, our development, our civilization matters. We will not allow people to subject it, to suppress it. And so send it to relatives and friends that they may benefit from it. And write and send us a comment below the presentation if you have any. And we believe that it will be a blessing to other people. And if you have any questions, we'll be able to answer them. God bless you.